And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
The ability of CO2 to do the heavy work of creating a climate catastrophe is almost nil at this point.
The price of oil has been artificially elevated to the point of insanity.
That's not how you power a modern industrial system.
The ultimate goal of this renewable energy, plan is to reach the exact same point that we're at now.
You know who's tried that? Germany. 7 straight days of no wind for Germany. Their factories are shutting down.
They really do act like weather didn't happen prior to 1910.
Today is Friday.
Yes, indeedy, folks. It is Friday again. Time for another edition of Climate Change Roundtable. This one is number 65 in a series. Seems amazing that we're already up to that many. Today we have with us our usual suspects, or our usual experts, whatever you'd like to call them. We have Linnea Lueken and Sterling Burnett. Sterling coming back on vacation after not being here last week. I hope you enjoyed that.
I did. Saw whales. I wanted to see the whales before Biden wiped them out with his wind farms.
And as an added feature today, you may hear clucking in the background. No, that's not from Greta. It's actually from Linnea. Linnea's got chickens in her room, believe it or not. She's preparing for the apocalypse of climate change, so she's got chickens now, right?
Yeah, well, I've had chickens for a while, but I got some new ones, and I made the mistake of mentioning it before the show started.
You should not have revealed that, Anthony. What you should have done is waited till they clucked and they said, "Hey, there's chicken little Greta in the background."
Good point. Okay.
You should name one of your chickens Greta.
They are Swedish.
And another AOC.
That calls for a new recipe, chicken a la Greta. We'll figure out what the ingredients are for that in a few minutes. Anyway, so with that, I want to talk today about our title. Every once in a while, the climate Illuminati goes sort of silent. They don't have any particular agenda that they're pushing on any particular week. This week was one of those weeks where we didn't have a specific topic to talk about, but there was lots of other noise in the climatosphere out there. And so we've got kind of a free-for-all show today, Climate Potpourri, which basically is going to cover several topics, and we're going to talk about these topics and comment on them. And hopefully you'll find that as entertaining as we did when we set it up and started talking about it. So our first topic today actually comes from last week, but it's really important. And this has to do with the waters of the United States, or the Sackett decision by the Supreme Court. For those of you unfamiliar with what WOTUS is, Waters of the United States, it was originally about navigable waters of the United States, like the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, streams and tributaries that might, allow ship passage, like the Sacramento River in Northern California, that used to be able to have steamboats coming up it, but doesn't have it any longer. But it is navigable. So the point is that this Waters of the United States rule was originally about protecting those streams and rivers that were navigable. But the elitists in Washington at the EPA decided, no, we have to regulate every bit of water on the United States, whether it's a puddle or a pond or whatever. And that caused lots of consternation because people that own properties that had like let's say a farm pond on their property used for, recreation and also maybe for fire protection, all of a sudden found themselves under the auspices of the EPA telling them what they could and could not do with their land. And as a result, it turned into a real fight. And that's what the Sackett versus EPA fight was about. Fortunately, reason and sensibility won with the Supreme Court, not just a little bit. 9-0. They threw it out. The EPA no longer has the jurisdiction to regulate your puddle or pond. Sterling, you've been following this for quite a while. What's your take on all of this?
Yeah, I've been following for decades. It's, you mentioned ponds and streams. It wasn't just ponds and streams. I think you've got a graphic under. It used to be navigable. WOTUS is relatively new invention. It's under Obama. He jettisoned the word navigable and tried to apply basically EPO zoning authority to more than half of the United States. If you look at the graphic that I sent, I don't know if it's if y'all lined it up, but it shows that I don't know if anyone's been out west, say to Arizona or Nevada or many of the Western Plateau lands. It's pretty arid. It's very dry, but sometimes they get a little rain and some of the land gets soggy and it has a few plants, and they want to declare all of that wetlands. The word wetlands never appears once in the Clean Water Act. Yeah, you can see. Okay, the white is the land that would not be covered by WOTUS. You tell me how much land is covered by WOTUS. It's almost all. That would give the EPA zoning authority. Basically, you'd have to go to them for permits to build if they wanted to enforce it that way. And they did. In the Sackett case, and Linnea wrote about this, and she may want to chime in, but it's been going on for 16 years now. A family wanted to build a house on about 0.63 acres of land in Idaho. And it was near 100 yards, near but not on a lake in Idaho. And it had a road between it and the lake, and ditches between it and the lake, and a housing division between it and the lake. And they went to build their house. They cleared some of their land, leveled it, and the EPA sent them a letter saying, you got to stop. That's a wetland. Not directly, but because your water might sink into the soil, go under the road, get into the drainage ditch, go into a stream. And so for 13 years, these poor people have been trying to develop their house. And initially the EPA said, you don't even have the authority to go to federal courts. They fought them on that. They said, you got to go through our administrative rulings. And by the way, we're going to fine you $40,000 a day. You don't comply and start filling your land back up. They challenged that. After 6 years, it reached the Supreme Court because the lower courts all said, yep, you got to go through the administrative hearing process. The Supreme Court says, no, when you're taking people's land, you can come directly to federal court. And they sent it back. Well, then the federal courts upheld the EPA's belief under previous court rulings that it was a wetland. And it reached the Supreme Court again, who said no. They overturned something called Rampano's. I'll let Linnea tell you about that. But they said no, 9-0. Even under the old rules, the liberals said this land does not qualify as a wetland. the EPA's gross misabuse of authority here. Even
Indeed.
though fuck that, right? But by a 5-4 decision, they really changed the landscape, and it goes so far beyond. I think this is the most important ruling since West Virginia v. EPA, and maybe more important than that, certainly going back decades for property rights. This is key. So, Linnea, why don't you take over?
Sure thing. So, correction though, it was unanimous that Sackett was in the right in Sackett versus EPA.
9-0.
Yeah,
9-0,
and then.
right.
But a lot of the time, and I think I mentioned this briefly last week when we just kind of, popped the news up there for a minute. Most of the articles that you read will talk about this 5-4 disagreement, or it's still a majority that you can't use what was decided in Rampano, I believe, which is known as which is known as the significant nexus test, which is absurdly broad. Everyone hated it. Justice Kennedy is the one, I believe, who came up with it. And basically no one liked it, but still the EPA references it as if it's the standard when it really is not. But the 5 justice majority that just agreed with this new one agreed with Scalia's opinion from Rampanos, where he said that the Clean Water Act defined WOTUS as relatively permanent, standing or flowing bodies of water. So something that you would definitely immediately recognize as a body of water. It has to have a continuous flowing connection, for example. Whereas the significant nexus test that they've been using for a long time said basically that if you can argue that water will soak into the ground and somehow become connected eventually to any kind of a wetland that might flow into an actual body of water, then that counts also as protected under the Clean Water Act, which is obviously, it's something that they were just using to, as we showed in that map, basically classify the entire continental United States as a wetland so that they can kind of arbitrarily enforce. And it has been very arbitrarily enforced over the last couple of years that it's been used or referenced at least. So
it's almost 15 years now that it's been referenced. I mean, you're
right. And they've been going back and forth on this. I mean, it's made it to the courts so many times, and it just keeps getting tossed back and forth. So this is a major win for land rights in the United States.
Basically, now, for the EPA to have any authority over your land, under the Clean Water Act, they might get it under ESA or something like that. But under the Clean Water Act, you have to have a flowing or directly connected body of water to a navigable waterway, and any wetlands adjoining that. So it has to be adjacent, not something distant, not something indirect, not something ephemeral that's only around for a couple of months a year or after a heavy rain.
Yeah, we've got a lot of those in Northern California, and those things have been causing trouble for decades. They're called vernal pools, and these things, they pop up briefly in the spring after rains. They last a few weeks, and in them there are some very simple life like fairy shrimp or other protozoans and so forth and so on. And the left goes out and creates these absurd declarations about the need to protect these things. Well, and so therefore the puddles must be protected and all this, and go into the diversity of life, and if we don't let these things live in these puddles, the whole food chain will collapse and we'll all die. All these crazy things that they do with this. And WOTUS was going to be the tool, the hammer that they were going to be able to use to shut down any and all development where there might be a puddle in the spring, which is just insane.
To be clear, this does not open the door to pollution. There's no evidence that waters are going to be more polluted because of this ruling, contrary to the media reporting saying it's handing, they keep saying, it's handing victory to polluters. The court has sided with polluters. You mean farmers? You mean landowners, guys who want to develop a house? So it's not going to add to pollution. And it doesn't necessarily leave wetlands, isolated wetlands, unprotected. Many states do this. If the states want to do that, it's their authority and right. It's not the federal government's. The federal government does not have zoning authority. The Clean Water Act did not grant the EPA that, and I don't think it could anyway under the constitutional separation of powers. But most importantly, if all the things, the vernal pools that Anthony talked about, or all the interconnections, really ephemeral, indistinct interconnections, if the federal government really, really believes that these are all critical, the Constitution provides a way for the federal government to provide those public goods, because that's what's been happening. Is it's supposedly a public good, but private parties have had to bear the cost. We have a Fifth Amendment. If the federal government really believes these things are all that valuable, they should pay the landowners for the public good they provide. But that's what the Fifth Amendment says they should do. Not that they should do, that they have to do.
Right. Yes, but when has the EPA ever followed the actual law? They follow their mission statement. Their mission statement is just way out there. Anyway, I don't know what else we can say about WOTUS and Sackett, except thank goodness the EPA got pushed back and the Supreme Court saw reason. Okay, on to our next topic. Speaking of reason, here's some unreasonable things. You've all probably heard of Jane Fonda. Yeah, she's a big deal, right? Well, guess what? She thinks white men and racism for climate change should get arrested in jail. That's right. Me and Sterling, Linnea is accepted, should go to jail for having our opinions about climate change. And apparently, because we have an opinion about climate change, we're racist. Go figure.
Now,
Yeah.
I actually didn't recognize climate change as being a racist thing, or or something unique to white males. I thought all races used cars and turned on lights and air conditioners, benefited from all those things, by the way. I, I look, Hanoi Jane has been wrong since the 1960s. And as far as I can tell, she has been right since the 1960s. She speaks without thinking through her words. She would have people locked up for thought crimes, I guess. 1984 may be her ideal of a Democratic run republic. I don't know. But to claim that climate change is racist, tell that to my African American natives, neighbors, right? That have their home, it's same home as, similar home as mine. I live in a subdivision with their air conditioning, and they've got 3 cars.
Yeah. Typically, what they want you to do is live in a hovel with chickens, right?
Listen.
Or just a study. Or just a study.
Right. Well, nothing more fun than intersectional politics right now, right? Yeah. It's if they can find a way to connect anything to racism, they will. What was it that she said that, and it's a pretty common thing that the alarmist crowd will say, is that climate change disproportionately affects non-white people or people in third world countries that are, I don't know, like African nations and stuff. And you can see where they come up with that logic, but they're just wrong. I mean, they're wrong fundamentally from the very beginning when they say that, climate change is, some huge existential threat in the first place. And then it's funny if you read between the lines and if you really think about what she's saying. She says there would be no climate crisis if there was no racism. There would be no climate crisis if there was no patriarchy. Yeah. Well, what do they think causes the climate crisis? Industrialization. So they're saying if there were no men, if there were no white men, there would be no industrialization. So I don't know. It's
yeah, boy, that's pretty demeaning to women right there, right?
It's a lot of questions that I gotta have.
Yeah. If there were no men, there'd be no industrialization. So we'd all live as we did 200 years ago and more. That's a recipe for a better life for everybody. Ask those people who are still living that way today in developing countries that actually want what we have.
Yeah, in countries where you don't have expansive, fossil fuel infrastructure, you have women dying in childbirth. You have, all sorts of terrible diseases that spread more easily because they don't have access to the kind of medical technology that we have. And it's in large part because the United Nations, World Economic Forum, all of the usual suspects on the other side of this argument are actively blocking the ability of other countries to develop. And they're doing it on purpose. So I don't want to hear it, Ms. Fonda.
Right. Yeah, I want to address something that Sterling talked about and Fonda referenced related to racism. The belief system that she has and a lot of climate alarmists have is the fact that because a lot of the disadvantaged people of color and so forth, tend to live in, well, for lack of a better word, slums in cities. It's been historically that way. Well, the problem with cities is the urban heat island effect. And so they extrapolate the urban heat island effect to be driven by climate change rather than the city itself. And as a result, therefore, urban minorities are much more impacted by climate change via the urban heat island effect. But it has nothing to do with climate. It has everything to do with the fact that the urban heat island, made entirely of concrete and steel and asphalt, absorbs the sun's rays during the day, stores that energy, and then releases it at night, keeping the average temperature up. That's as simple as it is. But they turn that into a racism issue, which just goes to show how completely inept they are at understanding basic science. Well,
that was a good monologue, Anthony.
Sorry, I didn't mean to have an uncomfortable pause there.
Oh, no, not at all.
You know, what's funny, Linnea, you said they're denying developing countries, energy that would be needed to raise them up, to make them basically less, more adaptive to climate change, whatever the cause, whatever the direction, whatever the source, right? More resilient, their societies. But it turns out, I saw a story recently this morning. I love this story. We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars in climate funding through the UN Climate Fund. And some of that money has been sent to developing countries to build coal-fired power plants, it turns out. So climate funding is building coal. And, the other amusing things that it's also going towards were gelato and making chocolate. I love it. Hotels in Haiti. Those are that's the battle against climate changes, the development.
Well, and we've written on this a lot at Climate Realism, where we say, what they don't, maybe they do realize, but what they don't acknowledge is that without fossil fuel infrastructure, nothing that we have is possible. I mean, you can't make steel without coal with current technology. You can't make hardly anything without fossil fuel derived products, especially plastics. Hospitals have amazing rates in the United States, at least, of survivability of different diseases that used to just take you out, in large part because we have better sanitation. All of those products are made with fossil fuels. All of your single-use needles that they are mad about single-use plastics, single-use needles are among that category because they tend to be made out of plastic. The syringe pump part, at least. It's the
bags,
right.
Blood,
all of your
blood,
IV bags,
saline, all your IV bags.
Yep.
The refrigeration that keeps medicines from spoiling, and that keeps food in everyone's home from spoiling, so we don't die from preventable foodborne diseases that killed millions and millions over the eons. All of that's made possible by fossil fuel.
Yep.
All the modern chemicals. But maybe Jane and her friends just, it may be that they're stupid and don't understand this. In her case, that might really be the case. But I think it's a lot of it just, they don't like people. They think there are too many.
They don't like people that aren't like them. That's the key.
They think there are too many of us, and that the world would be better off if there were just fewer people. And if this is what it takes to bring that about, the end of fossil fuel use, then it's all to the good for them. As far as
well, and I've seen them, they're starting to get pretty brazen about talking about that sort of exact depopulation subject. Jane Goodall said that the world would be healthiest if there were only 500 million people on it.
Right.
Okay.
Who gives them the right to decide?
A couple billion. Sure.
How do you measure the health of a planet? How healthy is Mars? Jupiter, healthy or not? Mercury, Venus, I don't know.
Mercury is not healthy because Mercury is toxic. It's poisonous. I'm kidding.
It's idiotic. They anthropomorphize a rock in space that, in this instance, happens to have life on it.
Yeah. Speaking of rocks in space with life on it, well, let's talk about cities, which are mostly rocks with life on it. We've got the urban heatland effect, and I wanted to point this out to people, that this graph here, and this actually came from the EPA originally, I believe, shows that temperatures in cities can be 4 degrees higher than the surrounding rural areas with forest and farms. That's got not one thing to do with climate change. And you can prove this to yourself. All you have to do is go outside of any city, even a small one, even like 30 or 40, 50,000 population, you'll be able to see this effect. Go outside the city into the farms and the green area. find a street or a thoroughfare that goes through the city and intersects it, watch your thermometer on your car. Drive through the city, particularly at night, on a windless night, and you'll be able to see this. And just drive through. Watch your thermometer go up as you get to the city center. It'll peak. And then as you drive away from the city, it'll drop down again once you get out into the green pasture areas and so forth. That's UHI, not one thing to do with climate change. But Hanoi Jane does not understand that. In fact, Hanoi Jane couldn't even be Hanoi Jane without fossil fuels, because how did she get to Vietnam back in the 60s? She took a plane. Gosh, they didn't have electric planes back then. Oh, wait, they don't have electric planes now that work anyway. Rant over. All right.
Oh, what else do we have on the docket?
All right. I'm sure we've got some other rant-worthy things. All right. This one's a real winner. Goats and power lines and labor law. What, you say? What's that got to do with anything? Well, in Northern California, where I used to live, we would have goats that would be there were actually people that had goat herds for rent. And this happened in the city of Chico, California, on a regular basis. They would bring goats into Bidwell Park, and the goats would go munch down all the weeds and underbrush and everything else. They'd put a fence in, and they would just basically clean the land to get rid of all of the flammable materials. Well, someone says now, we're being unfair to the goats. Watch this. This is just nuts.
So now from California, a new overtime law may put a damper on a pretty creative way to reduce wildfires. Landowners have been hiring goat herders and their goats to clear grassy areas that contribute to the blazes. But a change in labor laws may make this practice a lot more expensive. William Lajeunesse went out to see it for himself. Oceanside, California. Why is the overtime law such a big deal, William? Good morning.
Good morning, Bill. It's because as if this was to go through, they'd be paying a goat herder about $14,000 a month. That would mean hiring the goats would be too expensive, and they'd have to go to auction and probably be slaughtered. So here's the deal. We are in Oceanside. These 200 goats have been hired by SDG&E to clear the brush underneath these power lines, right? And they worked in this area, and they're going to go out there later today. So this has been going on for years. Reagan Library, cities, even the state of California hires goats to clear the brush in approaching fire season, right? It's cheaper than manpower, cleaner than machines, and it's less toxic than chemicals. And the goats get paid about $1 a day in water, no complaints. They show up happy tomorrow and sober, right? But that could stop because of this effort, as you mentioned, in the legislature that would make goat herders farm workers under the law. They'd be entitled to overtime, time and a half, anything over 8 hours. That's a problem because goat herders, when they're on the job site, are with the goats 24 hours a day. So they'd have to be paid for 24 hours at time and a half, or at least overtime. Here is the author of that bill, former Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez, who is now the head of the California Federation of Labor.
I think it also has a responsibility to make sure that the workers who are associated with it aren't being abused, that they're not being taken advantage of, that they, in fact, are being treated fairly.
So long story is, Bill, this situation is important in California because the goats are used because they can go into these high areas up here, into the steep areas, and it's where a bulldozer can't go. They're much cheaper than other alternatives. So this bill's in the legislature. They'll try to stop it. But right now, California labor has a lot of power in Sacramento. We'll see what happens.
Leave it to Sacramento to take something good and ruin it, you know?
They've got a natural way of clearing brush and grass. It's good for the goats. They get fed. It's good for the goat herds. They're not having to supplementary feed them, as they would if they didn't destroy them, if they didn't keep them in livestock pens, feeding them hay. And it's good for the herders because actually they have a job. They must think they're doing okay, or they wouldn't be in the goat herd business, I suspect. I've never heard of someone being forced to be a goat herd. I could be wrong. Maybe someone's forced to be a goat herd somewhere in the United States. That could be one of these weird forced labor things that I was unaware of. But my suspicion is not that this is a life they choose because they like it better than doing some other job. And they must be making a living. So like you say, look, this is Sacramento, this is California. They're the ones that say Newsom is ruining the state. The attorney generals are ruining, the district attorneys are ruining different cities, and yet they reelect them. So stupid people remain stupid.
Yep. My concern is, Linnea, are your chickens threatening to unionize?
They would if they could. It's too bad. They also eat all the weeds in my yard, so that's a bonus from them for the most part. But no, I don't pay them nothing. So
you pay them chicken feed.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
So you're admitting that you're exploiting your chickens.
Yeah.
Well,
gosh, it's not patriarchy. I don't know what the feminine term for that is, but that's what it is.
The absurdity of stuff that goes on in California these days, which is why I got out. I had to get out. The place was just effing nuts. I'm sorry. That's the way it is. Okay, speaking of effing nuts, net zero. That's the new thing. Yes, we have to go to net zero. Everything that is fossil fuels must be net zero in terms of production, and so the big pull it out of thin air goal is 2050 now. We've got to be hitting net zero by 2050 or the climate's going to kill us. Yes, we have to do that. And so now people are not paying any attention to the science or practicality or the engineering. No. Let's just be net zero by 2050. Let's just shut off everything that might produce carbon dioxide, because we have to hit that net zero goal, kind of like the Paris Climate Agreement goal, which isn't going to make any difference in the world. So now we've got people chasing net zero. And what's interesting about this is that people are now coming to the realization, ExxonMobil put out a report, I guess it was last week, I think Linnea wrote about it, saying, wait a minute, yes, we're in the fossil fuel business, but if you do this, it's going to lower the quality of life for everyone on the planet. We'll be back to the stone and stick age. We'll be living in huts with chickens again, all that stuff. So what do you guys think about this? I mean, is this just a ploy, or do these folks really believe we can get there?
My confusion is I thought Hanoi Jane said we'd be dead in 2030, and Ocasio-Cortez said the same thing. So net zero, as far as I can tell, is 20 years too late. And in fact, most of Biden's policies aim at 2030 or 2035 to get rid of things. So this 2050, gosh, he's an optimist as far as the most environmentalists are concerned at this stage. But you're right. Whether the target is 2030, 2035, 2040, or 2050, it's idiotic. It's completely foolish. It would make human society a worse place. We would have to expand the amount. It would even make the environment, the non-human environment, a worse place. We would have to do what we did in previous centuries to grow enough food to feed however many people survived. A lot of people don't realize this, but much of the continental U.S., much more of the continental U.S. used to be farmland than is today. Why? Because fossil fuels helped us grow land, has helped us grow food much more effectively on smaller parcels of land. Not so much land is devoted to grazing of horses that used to be common. Much of the former farmland in the Northeast has been reclaimed by forest. We'd have to clear that again if we go to net zero without fossil fuels. People who say things like this are not following the science. They're being science-y, I think that's a term that Anthony likes, sciencey. But they're not being scientific, and they clearly don't care about human welfare. They just don't.
Right. And if you went the full on scientific, utilitarian route, they also would get to the wrong answer, most likely, especially if they continue to believe that net zero is necessary in the first place, which it obviously is not. One of the worst things that has popped up in the last couple of years is there's a new word that I see everywhere, which is degrowth. Everyone is talking about degrowth. Everyone is talking about how we need to reduce energy demand. Why target? I thought that renewables were less expensive and more efficient than fossil fuels. Why on earth would I need to reduce energy demand in order to meet our energy requirements with net zero? It's obvious that they know that it's not the case. And it's obvious that the charade that they've been trying to hold up, that, believe us, it's cheaper. And yet, it's hard to sell a house if it has a solar roof. We wrote about that a while back. There's all sorts of inconvenient truths about what it does to the power grid when you add a bunch of intermittent sources while also taking down baseload sources. As good as nuclear is, you can't turn on nuclear as fast as you can turn on a coal plant. So it's I don't know. It's, as far as I can tell, it's all just some kind of money laundering thing. Like, it's just some kind of a scam. You're literally building windmills and building solar, and the money is, someone's making money, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. But it's not the American people, it's not the people of the world. And to an extent, sometimes it's not even the government that's subsidizing them. Although they are definitely getting special off the books handouts, I would think.
Yeah, and the thing is, if we end up with net zero, we're going to end up with a fraction of the energy availability that we have today. And we're going to end up with a loss of things that we're used to. Now, that one of the things that amazes me about some of these folks that are out there protesting about fossil fuels is they're out there with their iPhone and their nylon or rayon jacket to protect them from the cold, and their bicycles that are running generators to show how alternate energy can be made, and have, tires made out of synthetic rubber and all these other things. They have no clue about how petroleum products affect our life beyond just simply gasoline or natural gas or whatever. They just don't have a clue. I mean, imagine these people having to give up their MP3 players or their cell phones because, literally, if you were able to snap your fingers at one of these protests and take away everything that these folks are using or wearing that come from petroleum or petroleum-related extracts or products, they'd be standing there naked. They wouldn't even have their signs to hold up because a lot of the signs are made of foam core, which is a petroleum byproduct.
Right. Well,
they'd have to go to war with the animal rights folks because they'd have to take on fur again, right?
Right.
They'd have to. I can imagine Greta without the polyester and acrylic fibers that she probably uses. Maybe she only uses cotton. Oh, well, cotton is grown using fossil fuels to pump water and to harvest. And so you get rid of that. So what does that leave her? Well, I guess her parents that are living off her basically would have to go out and hunt with wooden sticks and, arrows, tips chiseled out of stone by hand. I don't know. Look, I actually do know some people who like doing that sort of thing. But I don't know people as a society who want to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, I kind of like carbon fiber arrows if we're going that route.
Yeah, it's madness.
And,
it is.
But it's misanthropy is what it is. It's misanthropy, and it's ignorance of where the materials and the things in common use come from. I saw an episode of a show called Black Mirror once, where people were living communally and they were on a bike. They were doing just what Anthony said. They were pedaling a bicycle. They were switching off throughout the day, pedaling this bicycle to generate electricity. And it's like, I looked at that bicycle and I thought, well, that bicycle is not made of wood. The chain is not made of some kind of natural fiber. The spokes and the wheels aren't wooden. They were all made of fossil fuels. So you've got rid of fossil fuels. If you get rid of fossil fuels, you don't have the bike to pedal.
Right. And what they don't seem to get is that, we're making clean green energy with this bicycle. Well, they're exhaling CO2 at an elevated rate anyway that they wouldn't normally do. So where's the savings in saving the planet? I don't get it. And again, these people don't think through their action. The biggest problem that we have in our society today is we have politicians and social engineering going on that are trying to determine how our power grid should exist and operate. These people have no engineering or science background. All they have is their own belief in a moral standard. And from that, they're making engineering decisions. And that is a recipe for disaster.
Yep. I wanted to cut in for a second. So guys, if you can leave comments or your questions and stuff that you have, we're getting around to the point where we'll probably start taking questions. And I want to walk us through like one logical process that it blows my mind that, it doesn't really, once you decide that the people who are pushing for like the end of fossil fuel based fertilizers and stuff, and once you start talking about the people who are saying that the world would be better off if 7 billion people died, you just have to accept that it's just evil and you really don't have to try too hard to work out their motives. But think about it. Think about this. So the common refrain from the climate alarmism crowd is that we have a problem with crop production because of climate change. They say drought is hurting crop production, flooding is hurting rice crop production, all sorts of stuff like that, right? The policies that they pass are to ban things like fossil fuel-based pesticides and fertilizers, right? They want to make gasoline and diesel fuel more expensive. So it's more expensive to harvest large yields of crops, okay? And then, so they basically want to mandate organic farming. And then they go and they try to shut down a bunch of cattle farms and animal farms because they say that those are the most carbon intensive agriculture that you can do, which is not true, but that's what they say. Where are they going to get their fertilizer if you're not using a fossil fuel fertilizer and you get rid of animal farming? They're not. And they either know it and they don't care because they're evil. And they know it and they just don't care because they're evil, or they are seriously stupid, breathtakingly stupid.
I think it's that. I think it is that they're just breathtakingly stupid, because I remember meeting Bill McKibben once. Now, Bill is a smart guy. He runs 350.org.
Good writer.
And I sat down with him over a beer at the Sierra Nevada Brewery in Northern California, and we talked about climate. And I would give him logical arguments that are factually based about stuff. And he would just roundly dismiss them as if they were nonsense. He had such a vision in his head of what the world should be under his belief system that he was not able to assimilate any of this information. But worse than that, he didn't really understand, I believe, how the world worked. He doesn't seem to have a full grasp on the whole, process of how things go from energy to production to table to family, all of this stuff. He just sees this as something that needs to be changed without really understanding the impacts.
Bill McKibben is an interesting case. I read one of his books when I was in graduate school and actually found it very powerful. I won't say compelling, but powerful. it was sort of a paean. I think the book was The End of Nature, to the loss of the natural world as he viewed it, as he believed it should continue to be for all time, evidently. But he has a very, very narrow view. He has a vision of the world, and what it should be. And I would say it's idiosyncratic, except that many people share this vision of the world, which is there's all these trees, and you do have to go out and harvest food. What you do is you pick it. You pick it from the trees, and you pick it up from the ground where the nuts and fruit have fallen. And you do low energy, low intensive agriculture. Low energy, by which I mean not a lot of labor intensive agriculture, but on small plots. He thinks that we should all live simpler lifestyles. And to be fair, he lives that simpler lifestyle.
Yes, he does.
His house is small. It is heated, I believe, through wood, and he may have some solar panels on it now. When he wrote The End of Nature, he didn't. But he thinks his way should be everybody's way, and that's not hubris. That's something much worse. He has a vision for the world, and he's willing to enforce it. Yeah, and he's willing to enforce it on everybody else. But he does, unlike a lot of these guys that I don't think really believe what they're saying. They're just profiting. He's a true believer.
He is. But he's a nice guy. I mean,
I'm sure he is.
I talked with him. We had a beer. It was a congenial conversation. He didn't call me a climate denier once or anything like that. But he's just simply misguided in his belief system. And anyway, what can you do? You can try to talk sense into people, but sometimes it's like, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him think. Anyway, let's get off of the net zero and all of that and on to the next absurdity. The Guardian says climate change on Mount Everest is causing extra deaths. Ooh. Well, I wrote an article about it earlier this week on climaterealism.com. And, they used an expert. Yes, a climate expert. Here they quote Yuba Raj Katawada as the source for their claim that deaths are increasing in Mount Everest. Well, he happens to be the travel director of Nepal. And he says climate change is having a big impact in the mountains. Wow, what an expert. What an expert. We get the travel director making climate science pronouncements. Well, in the same article, The Guardian also talks about, to their credit, but not to the credit of making a stupid headline, they talk about the other factors that are going on. And two other major factors exist. Number one, the government of Nepal issued more permits last year than ever for people to climb the mountain. That's right. You have to get a permit to climb Mount Everest. You get filtered out, because they just don't let any old fool go up there. You have to be a certain kind of fool to go up there. And so, yes, they've let some fools go up there. The other problem is that the climbing pattern has changed. It used to be that hardened climbers were, part of the process. But now we've got a lot of novice climbers who want to get to the summit of Mount Everest so that they can, put their picture up on the wall. I'm on top of Mount Everest, So what happens? You get a whole bunch more people. You get a bunch of novices going up there. One guy that they referenced went up all by himself. No oxygen, no guide, nothing. I'm just going to hike up to the top of Mount Everest because I know I can. And of course, what happens? He died. He wasn't prepared, but he got a permit. So where's the climate change in all of this? It isn't. But it just goes to show you how the newspaper, The Guardian, will take something as innocuous as this and turn it into a climate change story when there's absolutely no basis for it. It's incompetent journalism at its finest.
Yeah, you said other factors than climate change. No, climate change is not a factor at all. Okay. These are the factors.
Good point.
Right? These are the factors, and there may even be some more, but there is not a single point in the article. They didn't at any point in the article show any changes on Everest that have resulted over the past 30 years that would indicate the climate is changing. They didn't say storms are worse on Everest. They didn't say snow is deeper on Everest. They didn't say it's more erratic on Everest. Not there. So where's the climate change? The climate change is a tourism director. And these are the same guys that a few years back, maybe a decade back, told the WWF, oh, the glaciers are going to melt and they'll be gone by 2030 or 2035. And the IPCC published that in the report. And Rajendra Potpourri, or something like that.
Yeah, Potpourri,
who used to be the head of the IPCC, he defended that claim. He went out and trumpeted that claim. We're going to lose all these glaciers.
He described my article attacking this, factually attacking this as voodoo science.
And then it turns out, someone pointed out, well, this is not peer-reviewed literature. This is WWF, and they got it from a tourism director. And the scientist who works on, one of the scientists who works on Everest for India, he said, there's no evidence whatsoever that they're going to disappear. And the IPCC had to very publicly withdraw that claim and admit they were wrong. My suspicion is that they're not, because this wasn't made in an IPCC document, this claim won't be withdrawn. It will just be in a few months, you know, everyone will have forgotten that it was made.
Right. They did the same thing back in 2010. We caught them. They were claiming that by 2010, there would be, this is the IPCC, 50 million climate refugees, right? You know, people that have to get away from that nasty climate of where they live. Well, it turns out that there wasn't a single one, not one. And what happened is that the IPCC or the UN disappeared that, it was the UN disappeared that claim of 50 million climate refugees. And we caught them on it. And we published that on What's Up With That. I mean, if you go back through our archives on What's Up With That, you'll find all kinds of nonsense like this. But the point is that they made a claim, the claim was unsupportable, and rather than admitting we were wrong, they just disappear it. Because we can't be admitting we're wrong, because that'll hurt the whole climate change narrative, and people won't believe us anymore.
Well, I think we can get into, we have some good audience questions.
We got one more.
One more.
We don't have to hit the last topic. Let's just answer some questions.
Well, we got one more I want to show. This is quick.
Okay.
We have a Democratic congressman, Mr. Bowman, who calls for America's oil and gas industry to end. Watch.
We need to stop drilling for fossil fuels completely. But number two, we need an expedited way to get us to clean, renewable energy, or we will continue to have these severe weather events that we have been having for quite some time, and because of the warming of the planet.
Right. Well, just like I talked about those protesters, you know, and all the stuff that would disappear, that guy would be naked on camera if it wasn't for his rayon tie and his suit and all that other stuff. Anyway.
It may be a silk tie. He may have exploited silkworms for that tie.
That's possible. It could be silk, but you never know these days. You can't tell by looking at it whether that's silk or whether it's rayon or nylon or whatever. Point is that
go ahead.
The entire world would collapse if we didn't have fossil fuels. It's just that simple. And these folks don't get it.
Yeah, no, he's clearly not a very bright guy. He says, I like what he said at the end. He says, these extreme weather events we've been seeing for some time. Yeah, like throughout history, forever. Right.
Like
tornadoes existed long before anyone knew about climate change. Hurricanes hit coast long before the first oil was scooped. The first oil wasn't drilled; it was discovered on surface and exploited. All these extreme weather events that we've seen for some time, forever.
Well, you know,
and there's no evidence that the warming has made them any worse. In fact, the data does not show the warming has made them any worse. He's
right.
Just, you know.
But here's what they're going to do next. Mark my word. They're going to start saying that the current fossil fuel situation affecting the weather has teleconnected into the past, and therefore that's making the past weather worse. Watch, someone will do it. All right, enough of the absurdity. Let's bring on your questions. How do we get messages across the censorship blockade? I don't know.
It's something that the Heartland Institute has been working on for a while. It's good that we have allies, or at least a semi-ally now on the free speech front on Twitter, with Elon running things. I know there was a bit of a kerfuffle with Matt Walsh's documentary yesterday, but it seems to be up now, so it seems to be working pretty well. So they took down that censorship blockade. But the difficulty is that it is the mainstream media is still mainstream, right? People are still watching Wolf Blitzer, which is just, or at least people in airports are still watching Wolf Blitzer. So the difficulty is,
people.
What Sterling and I do writing for Climate Realism is we try to debunk by name specific media pieces that make false claims and connect them to climate change. As individuals who are not working for a larger organization, I would say just don't be quiet about it. I mean, especially on Facebook and stuff, you're going to get shut down. It's going to happen.
Let me request. So Christine, I don't know how the super chat works. I know nothing about that. But evidently you tried to ask a question that you made a contribution to, and it didn't come through this thing. Can you send it via the comment section so we can try and answer your question?
That is the question. It was ironically blocked by super chat, but
even
her
in
question is, how do we get through the censorship?
Over on the right, I see all these comments. She can't put a comment in there.
She did. That is the thing that's up on the screen right now. Was her original question was, how do we get our messages? So as in the climate realism message across a censorship blockade in social media. Like she was just blocked for some reason on posting her super chat question.
Right. I thought she had a question beyond.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No. So what I'm saying is, one of the common articles over the last 2 weeks have been the climate scientists are all ticked off because they keep getting people debating them in the comment section in Twitter now, when previously they were not getting that kind of engagement, because basically anyone who's posting stuff skeptical of the media narrative on climate change were getting blacklisted. You weren't able to see our posts, and so now that that's changed, climate alarmists are freaking out because they're actually having to engage, or they're seeing that their audience is needing to engage with the other side of the debate. And I think that has been helpful already. People are starting to realize that there's a little bit more to the conversation than just there's a catastrophe and we need to give up our lifestyles to fix it. So I think that, man, you just have to keep on keeping on with it. You can't give up on trying to spread, shows like this, or Anthony's website, What's Up With That, where there are a lot of people who are really good, genuine scientists who are writing and doing research and posting good work that doesn't get picked up by something like CNN. So it's a grind, but I think we're actually making some ground on it.
Yeah. All righty. So, what would happen if we got one of these deadlines like CA banning the sale of gas cars, and there aren't the resources available to meet the need? Wouldn't they just push the deadline back again? Well, yeah, that's been the whole thing with climate issues. They make 1989, the UN, some guy from the UN made the prediction that entire nations would be wiped off the face of the earth by sea level rise. Well, that never happened. So they keep pushing the predictions back. Today on Climate Realism, I have a piece up talking about sea level rise in California. And of course, it's out to 2100. But if you run the numbers, it's impossible. I just totally skewered these folks. But you're right. They just keep moving the goalpost forward and forward, because if they hit one of these things, then it doesn't happen. Then they're embarrassed, and they can't possibly be embarrassed because, we're saving the planet. We're righteous. So they push it back, saying, well, that prediction wasn't quite accurate. It's actually 2050 instead of 2035 or whatever. A good example of that is Dr. James Hansen, who had an interview back in, I think it was 1995 or whatever, saying that by 2015, the West Side Highway in New York City would be underwater due to sea level rise. Well, that deadline was approaching. What did he do? He contacted the original interviewer, our writer, and said, hey, we need to redo this. And so the writer pretends to ask him questions and basically says, oh, I misunderstood. It's actually not 2015, it's 2035 or 2045 or whatever they said. There's a clear-cut case of a prediction failing, not just badly, but miserably. And yet they had to move the goalpost forward because we couldn't let this prominent scientist be embarrassed.
Look, to Paul Ehrlich's credit, he's never embarrassed. He's always wrong. He's predicted hundreds of millions of people would starve in the 70s, that the coast would be underwater, that we couldn't produce food in the heartlands Midwest. He's never retracted any of those claims, and they were all wrong because he gave Dave certains. Now, we have real world examples of this. France is saying we need to cut back on our climate commitments. Why? To keep their society running. But California is a beautiful example of this. So they've set all these goals over time. Just last year, California's governor, on an emergency basis, had to say, no, we're going to try and extend the licensing of a nuclear power plant that I've railed against for 20 years, that I've tried to shut down. No, I've decided it's now safe to run it for a few more years. And he had to waive clean air rules at ports and tell people not to charge the electric cars he's been pushing so they could keep the power on. They run up against these deadlines. They run up against these mandates. And then what they do is an emergency. Well, I'm signing a thing saying you can continue to use diesel at ports. You don't have to plug in your ships at night and plug into the grid. Don't do that. Run that diesel. Run your generators. You're allowed to run those generators on an emergency basis so we can keep the entire system from collapsing.
Yeah, like I said, these people are social engineers, not real engineers. All right, one last question. I want to know how the world's going to end in 8 years. Let's see. With a bang? With a whimper? Ice? What? What do you think?
That one article that we saw a couple days ago that said that 7 of the 9, I guess, tiers
of the apocalypse
that prevent the world from becoming uninhabitable to human life have already been crossed. There's only 2 more seals to be broken, and then I guess the entire planet will just instantly become like Mars, just a dead rock in space. So I guess that's my guess. My guess is it'll just poof, the whole atmosphere will just explode. The end.
Plausible, very plausible. Yes.
Yeah. I what gets me about the whole 8-year deadline that AOC basically said, but others had said, is how the press could publish it with a straight face, as opposed to saying, look, we're not going to embarrass this sitting congresswoman like that. We're not going to publish a statement. There's no evidence whatsoever the world will end in 8 years. It's all over, is what she said. No evidence whatsoever. Now, I suppose if you're sort of an apocalyptic and you look up in the sky and you see 4 horsemen traversing it, that might be a signal the end of the world. But I've read the Bible, the relevant parts of the Bible, and I didn't see a deadline in 2030 is that's when they're going to show up.
No, I think it pretty explicitly says that you can't tell when they're going to show up.
Yeah, well, there you go. Maybe she had some insight we didn't have.
Yeah. So Jim asked, is the EPA even capable of exercising its power without abusing it? I don't think so. I don't think any bureaucracy
not just the EPA.
is.
Yeah, it's not just the EPA. It's no federal agency. Probably no state agency is. because the people who man those agencies want agency creep because they want more authority and more funding every year.
Yeah.
If they ever solved a problem.
I feel abused every time I use one of those EPA approved gas cans. You know, yeah. You ever tried to use one of those things? They're insane.
Just yesterday when I went to mow my lawn, I was so mad.
If they ever solved a problem, all these agencies are created to solve particular problems. If they ever solved a single one of those problems,
they'd be out of business.
They'd be out of business. And so those problems either never get solved or they solve those, but they find other problems that need solving.
Yeah, right. Well, the best we can hope for with the EPA is insolvency, right? Yeah, all right. So that wraps it up for our CCR number 65, Climate Potpourri. And believe me, we've covered a lot of potpourri, and some of it doesn't smell so good. Anyway, that's it for us. I want to remind you to visit climaterealism.com, climateataglance.com, and our new website that Linnea has put together called energyataglance.com. And be sure to hit the like button and, be sure to give us good reviews if you have the chance. And spread the link. Put it out there. Put it on YouTube. Put it up on Facebook. Put it up on any place you can. Take that URL for our show and put it out there and let people watch for themselves. Thanks for joining us this week. Thank you, Linnea. Thank you, Sterling. Good to have you again. We'll see you next week on Climate Change Roundtable. I'm Anthony Watt.